The heat inside the M4 Sherman tank was suffocation by degrees, a stagnant, oily 115 degrees Fahrenheit that made the air taste like diesel and unwashed bodies. It was 9:14 a.m. on July 14, 1944, 5 weeks after D-Day, and the American liberation of Europe was dying in a labyrinth of dirt and roots. Corporal James "Red" O'Malley, a 22-year-old loader from Chicago, wiped sweat from his eyes and peered through the periscope. 400 meters ahead, the world ended in a wall of green. This wasn't just a bush. This was the Bocage. For 1,000 years, French farmers had built these natural fences to keep cattle in, piling earth and stone 6 feet high, allowing oak and hawthorn roots to weave through the soil like steel cables. They were bulletproof, shell-proof, and currently they were the single greatest killer of American soldiers in the European theater. "Driver, advance, ram speed!" The commander screamed over the intercom, his voice cracking with a tension that vibrated through the steel hull. The 33-ton Sherman roared, its 400-horsepower right whirlwind engine screaming as it surged forward. The tank hit the base of the hedgerow at 18 miles per hour. But the earth didn't give way. Instead, the tank's nose rose. The tracks clawed uselessly at the vertical bank, lifting the front of the tank 5 feet into the air, exposing its thin 12mm floor armor to the sky. The Sherman looked less like a war machine and more like a beached whale, helpless and exposed. That was the moment the German gunner waiting on the other side pulled the trigger. A single 75mm armor-piercing shell from a hidden Panther tank slammed into the exposed underbelly of the American tank. It didn't just penetrate, it cored the machine like an apple. The ammunition rack ignited instantly. O'Malley was thrown against the turret ring, the concussion shattering his eardrums, as a fireball roughly the temperature of the sun consumed the oxygen in the compartment in 1.2 seconds. He scrambled out of the hatch, his uniform smoking, lungs burning, tumbling into the dirt just as the secondary explosion tore the turret off the chassis. He was one of the lucky ones. By mid-July 1944, the 1st U.S. Army was suffering 2,000 casualties for every mile gained. They weren't fighting a war of movement. They were fighting a war of inches in a leafy green hell where visibility was often less than 15 meters. General Omar Bradley, the commander of American ground forces, was staring at a catastrophe. He had 800,000 men and 150,000 vehicles bottled up in a beachhead less than 20 miles deep. If they didn't break out, the Germans would seal them in and push them back into the sea. But the solution wouldn't come from the Pentagon. It wouldn't come from a general with a map or a scientist with a slide rule. It would come from a 29-year-old sergeant from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron who used to drive a taxi in New Jersey. Sergeant Curtis Culin was not a military genius. He was a man who understood how to fix a carburetor with a dime and how to weld a bumper back onto a yellow cab in a rainstorm. He was quiet, chewing on unlit cigars, his hands permanently stained with grease and carbon. While the generals debated grand strategy in chateaus, miles behind the lines, Culin was lying in the mud of a maintenance depot near St. L, staring at the front of a Sherman tank and wondering why the smartest army in the world was being defeated by dirt. "It's simple physics, Sarge," Private Roberts, a welder from Tennessee, said, kicking the dirt bank they were using for testing. "We're trying to climb over a wall. You don't climb a wall if you want to kill the guy behind it. You go through it." Culin looked at the tank. The standard operating procedure was to have engineers rush forward, drill holes in the hedgerow earth, stuff them with 50 pounds of TNT, and blow a gap. It took 20 minutes to clear one hedgerow. The Germans had thousands of them. At that rate, the war would end in 1955. They had tried bulldozer blades, but they were too heavy, burning out the tank transmissions and throwing off the aim of the main gun. "We don't need a dozer," Culin mumbled, standing up and wiping his hands on his trousers. "We need a can opener." The breakthrough happened during a griping session on the night of July 18th. The men were tired, filthy, and demoralized. They were sitting around a small fire that was carefully shielded from German spotter planes. "If we just had some giant saw teeth," Roberts joked, cutting into a tin of rations with his bayonet. "Just slice right through the roots." Culin froze. He looked at the bayonet ripping through the metal tin. Then he looked toward the beaches, miles back. The invasion beaches were still littered with thousands of Czech Hedgehogs, massive 6-foot steel beams welded together in star shapes, placed by Rommel to rip the bottoms out of American landing craft. They were made of high-tensile industrial steel. They were heavy, sharp, and they were literally garbage now. "Roberts," Culin said, his voice dropping to that low, intense pitch that usually meant trouble. "Grab the acetylene torch. We're going to the scrapyard." For the next 14 hours, Culin and his team didn't sleep. They dragged 4 of the massive German steel beams into their field garage. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and melting iron as the blue-white arc of the welders lit up the night. Culin didn't draw blueprints. He didn't run calculations. He worked by eye and by feel, cutting the beams into jagged, angled prongs, tusks that looked like something out of a medieval nightmare. He cut the steel into 4 distinct blades, 2 large ones for the tracks, 2 smaller ones for the center. He welded them directly onto the final drive housing of a beat-up Stuart light tank. It wasn't pretty. It looked like a Mad Max modification born of desperation. The welds were thick and ugly, but they held. "It looks like a rhinoceros," Roberts said, tapping the cooling steel with a hammer. It rang like a church bell. At 06 hour on July 20th, Culin drove the modified tank to a test field. A crowd of skeptics had gathered, majors, colonels, engineers, who said it wouldn't work, that the stress would snap the final drive, or that the angle was wrong. Culin ignored them. He buttoned up the hatch, revved the engine until it screamed, and dropped the clutch. The tank didn't climb. When the Rhino hit the hedgerow, the steel tusks bit deep into the ancient root system. The force of the 15-ton vehicle transferred directly into the blades. There was a sound like tearing canvas, magnified 1,000 times, the screaming snap of 4-inch oak roots giving way. The tank didn't rise an inch. It plowed forward, the earth exploding upward and outward, burying the front hull in dirt, but keeping the tracks flat on the ground. In 4.5 seconds, Culin had cut a hole through a barrier that had stopped the U.S. Army for 6 weeks. He backed the tank out, the steel tusks shining and polished from the friction of the earth. The silence in the field was absolute. Then a colonel from the Ordnance Department started running toward the tank. But victory wasn't that simple. Innovation in the military never is. News of the Rhino reached General Omar Bradley the next morning. He came to see it himself. He watched a Sherman tank equipped with Culin's device smash through a bank that was 7 feet thick. Bradley, known as the GI's general, climbed down from his jeep, walked up to the jagged, rusty steel teeth, and touched them. "How many of these can you make?" Bradley asked, turning to Culin. "Sir, as many as we have steel for," Culin replied, standing at rigid attention, grease still under his fingernails. "We launch Operation Cobra in 4 days," Bradley said, his face grim. "I need 500 of them." "And, Sergeant, if this doesn't work when the shooting starts, the whole division is going to die in those fields." 500 tanks, 96 hours. The logistics were impossible. They needed 150 tons of scrap steel. They needed every welder in Normandy. Culin was no longer just a mechanic. He was now the foreman of the most frantic manufacturing operation of the war. Teams were sent racing back to Omaha and Utah beaches to scavenge the German obstacles. It was a beautiful, savage irony. The steel Hitler had placed to stop the invasion would now be the tool used to destroy his army. The nights of July 22nd and 23rd were a blur of blinding light and exhausted men. Culin organized assembly lines in open fields. Maintenance crews worked in 18-hour shifts. The sound of grinders and welding torches drowned out the distant artillery. They weren't just welding, they were modifying the tactic of armored warfare on the fly. But as the deadline approached, a new problem emerged. The German steel was too hard. It was breaking the American cutting blades. They were running out of acetylene gas. They were running out of welding rods. On the night of July 24th, with Operation Cobra set to launch at dawn the next day, Culin was inspecting a row of modified Shermans. He looked at the jagged teeth on the lead tank. They were rough, hurried, and untested in actual combat. Cutting a dirt bank in a test field was one thing. Doing it while 80 mm anti-tank guns were firing at you was another. If the welds failed, the tanks would be hung up on the hedgerows, immobile targets for the waiting panzers. The entire breakout strategy relied on these rusty pieces of scrap metal holding together against thousands of pounds of pressure. The sun began to rise on July 25, 1944. The ground shook as 1,500 B-17 bombers began the preliminary carpet bombing. Sergeant Curtis Culin stood by his command jeep, watching the 2nd Armored Division rev their engines. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic taste of fear. The order came down the line. "Move out." The lead Sherman, nicknamed Juggernaut, lurched forward toward the first hedgerow. Culin held his breath. This was it, the moment of truth. The tank gathered speed, heading straight for a wall of earth that had claimed thousands of lives. It hit the wall. The collision was not a crash. It was an earth-shattering tear that sounded like the world being ripped in half. Juggernaut didn't climb. It didn't expose its thin belly armor to the German anti-tank teams waiting with Panzerfausts on the other side. Instead, the 4 welded steel tusks bit into the base of the hedgerow with the force of a prehistoric beast. The 33-ton Sherman shuddered violently, the right whirlwind engine screaming at 2,400 RPM, but the tracks stayed flat on the ground. In a cloud of flying dirt, pulverized roots, and splintered ancient oak, the tank simply drove through the wall. For the German paratroopers of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division hiding on the reverse slope, it was a moment of paralyzing cognitive dissonance. Their entire defensive doctrine, drilled into them for 2 months, relied on the Americans being forced to use the roads or climb the hedges. They were waiting for the lift, the exposed underbelly, the easy kill. Instead, a wall of dirt exploded outward, burying a machine gun team alive. Through the dust, the nose of the Sherman emerged, its 75mm main gun level, stable, and pointing directly at them. "Fire! Canister! Now!" the tank commander screamed. The main gun roared. A canister round, essentially a giant shotgun shell filled with hundreds of steel balls, turned the hedgerow into a slaughterhouse. Because the tank had stayed level, the gunner didn't have to wait for the chassis to settle. He fired 0.8 seconds after breaching. The German ambush team was liquidated, before they could even lift their weapons. And it wasn't just one tank. All along the St. Lo sector, the morning of July 25th transformed from a stalemate into a mechanical stampede. 300 Rhino tanks hit the Hedgerows simultaneously. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was catastrophic. The safe, claustrophobic squares of the Bocage, which had been their fortress, suddenly became their tomb. Sergeant Curtis Culin watched through binoculars as a column of the 2nd Armored Division disappeared into the greenery, moving cross-country at 12 miles per hour. They weren't using the roads. They weren't bottling up at intersections. They were flowing through the fields like water through a sieve, bypassing minefields and flanking German strongpoints that had held out for weeks. "It works, Sarge!" Private Roberts yelled over the roar of artillery, slapping Culin on the back so hard he nearly knocked the cigar out of his mouth. "The damn scrap metal works!" By noon, the American forces had advanced 3 miles, a distance that had previously taken them 3 weeks and 5,000 casualties to cover. But the real test came at 14 Fauxmont near the village of Marigny. A platoon of 4 Rhino-equipped Shermans ran headlong into a waiting ambush of 3 German Panzer IV tanks. Under normal circumstances, this was a death sentence. The Panzer IV had a high-velocity 75mm gun that could punch through a Sherman at long range. But the Germans were watching the road. They were set up in a classic L ambush, their guns trained on the intersection, camouflage nets perfectly blending with the leaves. They never saw the Americans coming. The Rhino tanks burst through the hedgerow on the Germans' right flank, emerging from a solid wall of vegetation just 40 meters away. The German crews didn't even have time to traverse their turrets. The American gunners, firing point-blank into the thinner side armor of the Panzers, brewed up all 3 enemy tanks in under 60 seconds. It was a massacre of machinery. The burning hulks of the Panzers sent pillars of black, oily smoke into the summer sky, marking the end of the German armored superiority in the Bocage. The breakout, codenamed Operation Cobra, was no longer a battle. It was a rout. The Culin Cutter, as the press would soon call it, allowed General Bradley's forces to encircle the German 7th Army. They weren't just pushing the enemy back, they were cutting off their retreat. By July 28th, the Americans had captured Coutances. By July 31st, they were in Avranches, the gateway to Brittany and the open French countryside. The static, grinding hell of the Hedgerows was over. The war of movement had begun. But the Germans adapted. They always did. General Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, realizing his static defenses were useless, ordered his troops to abandon the hedgerows and retreat to the rivers. But the retreat turned into a nightmare. Because the American tanks could now move parallel to the roads through the fields, they could overtake the retreating German horse-drawn columns. It created the Falaise Pocket, a killing ground where 50,000 German soldiers were surrounded. The Rhino tanks, covered in dust and dents, acted as the anvil against which the German army was hammered. And what of the man who started it all? Sergeant Curtis Culin didn't get a promotion to general. He didn't get a ticker tape parade in New York City. He got a pat on the back and new orders. The war didn't stop for innovators. He continued to serve with the 102nd Cavalry, pushing deeper into France, then Belgium, then toward the German border. The tragedy of the ordinary hero is that luck eventually runs out. 4 months later, in November 1944, Culin was fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, a dark, dense woodland that was even worse than the hedgerows. There were no banks to cut through here, just mines and artillery tree bursts. While scouting a position, Culin stepped on a German shoe mine, a small, vicious anti-personnel mine encased in wood to evade metal detectors. The explosion took his leg. The man who had given legs to the American Armored Division, allowing it to sprint across France, was sent home on a stretcher, his war over. He returned to the United States a disabled veteran, back to the quiet life of a salesman in New Jersey. But the math of his contribution is staggering. Military historians estimate that during the first week of the breakout, the Rhino device saved approximately 4,500 American lives. Without it, the infantry would have been forced to storm each hedgerow explicitly, running into machine gun fire again and again. More importantly, it bought time. If the breakout had been delayed by another month, the German army might have reorganized. The V-1 and V-2 rocket sites in France would have remained operational longer, raining more death on London. The Soviet advance in the east might have stalled. The simple act of welding rusted invasion scrap to the front of a tank accelerated the end of the war in Europe by months. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later wrote that the Culin hedgerow device was one of the 3 most significant tactical innovations of the war, ranking right alongside the proximity fuse and the landing craft. Think about the cost. The Rhino modification cost the U.S. Army about $15 in welding materials and scrap steel per tank. The alternative was losing a $50,000 Sherman tank and its 5-man crew every time they tried to cross a field. It was an ROI of infinity. The legacy of Curtis Culin isn't found in a complex military manual. It's found in the philosophy of the American GI. The ability to look at a problem, a deadly, impossible problem like a 1,000-year-old dirt wall, and solve it with a blowtorch and some garbage. It killed the myth of the superior German engineering. The Germans had the Tiger tank, a 60-ton monster of precision engineering. The Americans had a taxi driver from New Jersey who knew how to improvise. And the taxi driver won. In the end, the iron cage of Normandy wasn't broken by a superweapon. It was broken by a rusty set of teeth, forged in the dark by tired men who just wanted to go home. If you want to discover more insane stories of how ordinary people changed the course of history with nothing but grit and a welding torch, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We are digging up these lost archives and dropping new videos every single day. Don't just watch history. Be part of uncovering it.